Thank you so much. Sorry, we practiced getting the PowerPoint up, and let me make sure I've got the right slides. Play from current slide. Great. Thank you all so much. Let me know if audio or any problems are here. I'm Valerie Threlfall. I'm the founder and managing director of a program called Listen for Good. I'm excited to have Virginia Taylor here with me from Open Door Legal to be presenting. And just wanted to give you a quick run of show for today. I'm going to talk a bit about feedback. What is feedback? Why is it important? We'll talk through some best practices for how to build effective and equitable feedback practices focused on your clients. Pause for a little Q&A, and then we will have a longer conversation with Virginia where I'll ask her about her approach at Open Door Legal and their experience with gathering quality feedback and building a feedback practice. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So hopefully lots of rich content. Please do chat in questions. I do a lot of Zoom presentations, and it's always just so much nicer to know that if things are resonating or what's not resonating. So please aim to, chat in liberally, I guess would be my guidance. So let me just start quickly with a little bit of framing about who we are, Listen for Good, and who I am. So I run Listen for Good, which is a capacity building program, a national capacity building program that works with nonprofits of all different kind of types and stripes to help them build high quality feedback practices focused on their clients. This is actually my second sort of feedback effort. I was the prior director of an organization called Youth Truth that surveyed young people about what's working and not working in their schools. So have been swimming in this pond for about 15 years or so. Listen for Good is, I mentioned, national program. So we've worked with over 750 organizations nationwide, a lot in California. I know many of you are here from California. And we've worked with a small but hopefully growing cohort of legal aid organizations as well. So what do we do, and sort of how do we think about feedback? We are a program that provides a range of supports to organizations to help you strengthen that practice on how you're going to be hearing from your clients. One of the key facets that how we think about gathering and using feedback is this concept of a loop. For many of you, this may look very familiar. It's sort of a continuous improvement cycle. But what we often find is that when people think about gathering feedback or using data, it's sometimes it's positioned as kind of an extractive experience where you are gathering data and using it. We actually think with feedback data in particular, there's a unique opportunity to really reframe data collection into much more of a two-way experience that really also has client engagement at its core. So it's an opportunity to do data collection a little bit differently. How we support organizations we have three main pillars. So since 2016, we've had these different kinds of supports. We have some interactive tools that are more technically focused that organizations use to build a feedback practice. We have webinars and group learning. And then we have a coaching program. So we pair organizations with coaches from across the country who are experienced in guiding organizations through this practice of building feedback loops. So let me just step back for a minute and talk a little bit about and align us all on what we mean by feedback. We all get feedback all the time. I have a 10-year-old. I get lots of feedback on the quality of the lunches that I pull together, as well as many other things. But and how embarrassing I am. But feedback, is really a unique kind of data, and it is gathering input from people about their experiences with an organization, their perspectives, their feelings, and their opinions about their experience. Some of the types of questions that you therefore tend to see when you're asking for feedback, I just lost my screen for 1 second, are really things such as, do you feel like your needs are met? Could we do this service better? How, was this helpful? One of the things that's differentiating about feedback is there's not really right answers. This is really input from people based on their perceived experience of the interaction that you have with them. I'm going to contrast that with outcomes. I know a lot of you and a lot of us in the sector are gathering outcome data. So these are what I would call more looking at sort of the changes in how somebody's different as a result of the programming. Sometimes these are self-reported, there's other ways to get them. And I think just one key differentiator is that, outcomes are often predetermined by others. Often they're imposed, maybe by funders or others. And in contrast, feedback is something where there's not as much of sort of there's obviously you want good feedback, but there's less of a sort of preferred answer that you're seeking. So why do we think it's important to focus on feedback? A lot of reasons. First, I think those of us who design programs have great intentions, but we have blind spots and biases in terms of how we design an intervention. And we make a lot of assumptions when we design programs or are providing even things such as thinking about how will people want to interact with us. There's a lot of assumptions that we make as we're doing that. And so feedback's an opportunity to really test those assumptions. We also know that negative experiences is just natural. When somebody has a negative experience, it can actually reduce their incentive and desire to participate and engage, which inevitably leads to worse outcomes. So really one way to think about feedback, and there's actually growing research about this, is that it really can be an early warning sign and be used as a tool to understand what's going to sort of longer term outcomes, but it can kind of serve as your ongoing monitoring system for those longer term outcomes. Feedback also provides a very client-centered way to talk about your impact. We talk, one of the things that I know many legal aid organizations and nonprofits generally are really thinking about how are you demonstrating your impact and raising money and advocating. And feedback is a very client-centered way to round out and share information about the difference that your legal services are making in the community. And finally, we believe that feedback can really be a powerful tool for starting to share and shift power and advance equity. I'll talk more about this in a second, but really it's an opportunity to change the conversation and the relationship with clients. So they are not just recipients, but really starting to center on clients more effectively and bring them into it can open up and create opportunities to bring them into broader organizational decision-making. So let me just expand on each of these concepts a little bit. So one way, feedback, a primary reason actually to really gather feedback is that it can and you'll hear about this from Virginia and her experience at Open Door Legal, is that it's really a way to get better at what you do. Feedback can inform your strategy. It can inform sort of differences or inequities in terms of service delivery. And it also helps you sort of identify problem spots in your implementation. That's kind of the dominant motivation. Feedback can also be really powerful, though, for advocating for change. So one example, we worked with an organization, Habitat for Humanity of Greater Memphis. This was in a small way that what the feedback data that this organization gathered enabled them to have harder evidence about sort of the needs of needing to justify, frankly, an additional staff member that they needed. So in this case, Habitat had a program where they were retrofitting homes so that people could age in place. And hearing the feedback provided demonstrated the need for a social worker to be on staff to really help with the variety of care needs that came back. On a broader scale, we've also seen at Listen for Good across the organizations we've worked with that feedback can be used for advocacy. This is a very scaled example, but worked with a statewide agency named First Steps in South Carolina, which is an early childhood agency. And they were able to use feedback to really not only around 4K, it was around the idea of 4K, which is the sort of preschool program in South Carolina. And so First Steps gathered feedback from practitioners and families about the 4K program, and then they were able to roll up this feedback and use it as an opportunity to advocate for policy with policymakers, and was even cited, the data and feedback data that they gathered was even cited in the governor's State of the State address recently. I alluded to this earlier, but feedback also provides a foundation for deeper equity work. Listen for Good believes strongly that to be high quality, you have to be centered in equity. And so one of the things that we find is that really building a strong feedback practice can really anchor and serve as sort of a core grounding force for thinking about other ways of bringing clients into more co-creation and decision-making models, whether that's having clients become part of advisory structures, becoming part of governance structures, but that it can really anchor and be a core complement to these other deeper engagement work that you may do with smaller numbers of clients. One example of this is we worked with an organization, Children's Law Center out of Washington, D.C. They gathered feedback from a couple different populations. They got feedback from their brief assistance clients, as well as clients who participated in their training. And one of the benefits of gathering feedback and going through that process was it gave them an opportunity to also really experiment with mixed methods when they tried to think about how they could reach clients. So they started to realize they didn't have numbers, they didn't have the right contact information. What's the balance of ways in which they need, what data do they need to, even if they wanted to reach people, what were people's preferred way of engaging with them? And then, as highlighted here, really use the opportunity in that experience to start to change the conversation about how listening could be integrated into their ongoing culture. So I want to pivot just quickly and talk a bit about how to do this well. So there's a lot of, and I appreciate everyone, some people submitted some questions in advance asking sort of what's the best practices here. So it's a lot to go through in a short amount of time, but I'll try and give some highlights and happy to answer Q&A. And I think Virginia's experience will also really bring this all to life for you, for all of us. But let me go through a little bit how to do this well. So again, I noted earlier, this concept that feedback is not just you gather feedback and you interpret it, but one of the core things that we think about at Listen for Good and coach people through is this idea of gathering feedback. Then you have to, you gather when designing and collecting, you interpret it, but then you do something with it. That's also somewhere where we often get stuck as a sector, is sort of the use of this kind of data to actually inform change. So let me talk through some best practices across this loop. The first step of a high quality feedback loop is really being mindful and thinking about the purpose of the feedback. What do you want to know, and what can your clients really tell you about? Our general guidance is to think about things that you can do something about. So ideally trying to think about sort of the relevant questions where you may have made some assumptions and you have an opportunity to test. Is it about what kinds of services are provided? Is it about when and how people can access services? These are the kinds of questions that might feel very relevant for the client population that you serve. I do think also at the same time, though, hearing from some about sort of unmet needs and things that maybe are a little more systematic is also super helpful insight. And as I mentioned earlier, can be used powerfully when you're trying to advocate for broader changes. But encourage you to think about sort of what assumptions are you making about their experience that you may want to validate or test and say, maybe this is a wrong assumption about how they might want to interact. Also thinking about sort of their experience. So as a practitioner, we're all making assumptions that maybe the quality of the experience that people are having is consistent across our programs or across our sites. Great opportunity to test and validate and see if that is indeed true. Lots of different ways to gather feedback. I won't go through all of these in detail, but there's sort of more polling-esque ways to gather feedback. Surveys are a powerful tool. Listen for Good is a survey-based program, so we tend to talk about and center surveys in our approaches. Focus groups or interviews and advisory boards are also very powerful ways to get input and feedback. I think the major difference between the left-hand side of this slide and the right-hand side of the slide is really a depth versus breadth question. So obviously, when you're doing more focus groups or small interviews or smaller groups of people, you get much more qualitative information, which can be extremely rich, but it's from a limited number. Whereas then, when you're working with surveys or other tools, you're able to hear from many more people in a more rapid fashion. Kind of need a balance of both at the end of the day, but those are kind of the main trade-offs. The other thing that we find as a major trade-off is just when you get this kind of data back, there's very different analytical approaches. So When you have survey data, you've got to have somebody who can look at quantitative data and analyze data. And then in contrast, when you've got sort of more qualitative input coming in through focus groups or interviews, that's a different kind of analytical burden. One of the things I think that maybe is frustrating, but having been in the field for a long time, is that feedback and sort of the choice of how you build a feedback practice, I hate to say there isn't always one best practice. It really comes down to trade-offs. So much of this comes down to what trade-offs you want to make and what's really the priority for your organization. A second key, when it comes to data collection, it's really important to keep two principles in mind. One is thinking about how can you gather data in a way that, in our case, as I mentioned, I have kind of a bias to survey. So we're really interested in helping and supporting organizations to capture capture feedback from the largest number of people possible. A common frustration I hear from organizations is they administer surveys or try and gather feedback and they don't hear from enough people. So we're really trying to counter that. And I think a key principle is always to think about how can I hear from as many people as possible. But then I'll talk in a minute about, you also have to think about sort of the how you approach it and what you say as part of how you're gathering that feedback. There's an opportunity, though, when you're thinking about how you gather feedback, and one of the concepts that we think pretty expansively about at Listen for Good is accessibility. So encourage you to see this as an opportunity to be flexible. Think about maybe doing multiple methods, because if you're really trying to hear from that largest number of people, you may need to do something very contextual and employ different methods to reach the largest number of people possible. At Listen for Good, we've seen people administer surveys in all different types and stripes. Again, you'll hear from Virginia about their experience. It was pretty tech mediated. A lot of people, though, that we work with, and I know there were some questions in advance, a lot of organizations that we work with still use paper as a way to gather input. They find that that's important because of people's comfort and access to digital technology. Phones and interviews are a powerful way. So it's really about adapting to your context. And as I mentioned, thinking about ways to maybe employ multiple methods to reach the largest number of people possible. When you think about feedback, another thing that I think is also differentiating is recognizing that gathering feedback is not that you're operating in a context that has a power dynamic in place. And so one of the things that's really important is to think about how you message this, and that actually messaging and being thoughtful about the messaging, our experience has shown, can really shape the kind of engagement that you get on the back end from clients. Clients are cynical, and as they should be, about providing feedback, because they have often seen feedback go into a black hole and do nothing. And so what you're trying to counter is that, and what you have to fight against is that predisposition and notion that there's a disbelief that their feedback is ever going to matter. So some of the things that are important to do is be really intentional about saying what you're going to be doing with it, that you're using the feedback to improve. This is not punitive, and being explicit that the feedback is consequence-free in terms of the fact that it will have no bearing in reducing their access to services. Another key kind of concept related to that is to think about the level of anonymity or confidentiality that you can provide. So if you can provide anonymity when you're gathering feedback from people, that can be really helpful in terms of promoting candor. You might choose not to, we'll talk about that later, but and for different reasons, but just being explicit about it is important for clients to see. And then just a foreshadowing, one of the concepts that you'll see through these sort of 5 steps that of sort of a high quality feedback loop is that you want to tell people that you're going to share back what you heard. That's a powerful message, and that really can go a long way to overcoming the understandable lack of trust or sort of belief that somebody's feedback is really going to matter. Let me just give a quick example of an organization and how they tweaked with this. So we worked with an organization, Community Legal Services, out of mid-Florida. And they did a couple different loops. And one of the things, and I know, one of the common challenges in legal aid is sort of how do you get information about the early intake process and the experience that clients have. And so they actually did a very focused effort on getting feedback on that early intake process. So they focus first on hearing about sort of the interactions that clients had with their phone system. And then secondly, the client experience specifically with the helpline, as well as sort of how the process, the call flow went. And one of the things, I was looking back at their materials yesterday, and one of the things was they were very open about the fact that they had to do a lot of experimentation to get this right. So in their case, they started by moving originally from mailing surveys to people months later to then emailing surveys. Well, they emailed surveys within a week. Then they tried emailing surveys immediately following the call and the interaction somebody had on the helpline. And so really did a lot of experimentation to figure out what worked for their population. They surveyed over 2,000 clients as part of this effort and got about a 20% response rate, which is pretty great for an emailed survey. So just encouraging this idea of thinking about your context and not being afraid of doing some experimentation along the way. Rounding out around this, the curve, once you have data, the next thing is you have to think about what does it mean? And if I can give one message here and one takeaway, there's a concept called segmentation, which is really, or disaggregation, which is really taking all the feedback and just starting to look for patterns underneath. That could be patterns by client demographics, that can be patterns by site, but this is where you quickly can get some real insights and power from your feedback effort, is if you start to look at differences within different subgroups. So let me just give a quick example, not in the legal aid space, but worked with an organization that was in Arizona. Mostly it was a youth, this is data from a youth development program. They mostly served Hispanic and white families. They had a small number of Black and multiracial families. They asked questions asking, do you feel treated with respect? Do you feel connected to staff? And if you imagine, look at these numbers, if you were looking at just the overall averages, things would look pretty good because the majority of the clients that were served identified as white or Hispanic. However, the minute that they disaggregated this data, you can see that even though a smaller number of clients may have identified as Black or multiracial, that their experience was very different and much less positive than the other groups. So this gave this organization a very powerful way to target their response and think about how they were going to design and respond to this feedback. So just a great example of the power of segmentation. Moving along, you then have to think about sharing the data and how are you going to use it internally and come up with that response. One thing that, I know it's complicated to think about how to respond to data. It's complicated to think about the budgetary implications of what you can do and how are you going to respond to the requested changes. We can talk about that in Q&A and some of the trade-offs there. But first, you have to share the data internally. So an important principle is to be thoughtful about who you're sharing it with. And really one thing nugget is to think about the sequencing. So what's the right order? And that's going to differ by your organizational culture. In some organizational cultures, you'll want to sort of share it first with the people on the front lines who are interacting with clients, and then kind of work it up the chain. In other contexts, you might want to share it the opposite way. So it's really thinking about your culture and what works best for you. Across the board, though, one of the other things I've seen is that it's hard to get feedback data back, particularly critical data, especially when people are working so hard to do good work. And so there's this kind of years ago coined this idea called the 4Ds, my colleague Jen Wilka and I, and these were just some of the common responses. So just wanted to put a little name to it of how colleagues may react. So sometimes people often get defensive. I sort of would see people fall into these 4 buckets. So people would get defensive. Some people would start to get dismissive, and one of the best ways to do that is to start to question the validity of the effort in terms of the methodology. So you didn't do it on the right day, you didn't talk to the right people, those kinds of things. Other people might feel just downright dejected and sort of really just say, I don't know what to do. This is just awful. And then other people will kind of spin it positive. So they'll be like, well, they said some negative things and, but let's really focus on the positive. All very common human reactions, but things to just keep in mind as you're starting to share data. Because I mentioned the primary goal of gathering feedback is really to drive improvement. It's really important to, yes, celebrate the good, and you'll hear about that also from Virginia, but also, think about where you can improve and how could you make the organization more effective. The last step of a quality feedback loop is this concept I alluded to earlier of closing the loop. And this is telling people what you heard and what you're doing in response. When we work with organizations, this isn't like a hard step, but we often hear from them that it feels the most foreign. It's the newest thing for them to do. It's a muscle that we haven't done and we're not all very good at in general, is doing that last little step of sharing back what you heard. So here, it's not about sharing all, 75 pieces of data. It's about sharing kind of the key themes. Here's what we heard. Thank you for telling us. And here's what we're going to do in response. This is just an example of an organization that we worked with and the kind of feedback that they gathered as a way to close or kind of shared as part of their effort to close the loop. We see organizations close the loop in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's posters, sometimes it's meetings, sometimes it's town halls, sometimes it's videos. I saw a youth development program gamify the closing the loop process and turn it into a Jeopardy game with their students. Like, you can have fun with this. And that's the other message I think I'd want to leave with today, is that, this is an engagement opportunity. So what's lovely and I think unique about feedback is it's an opportunity to gather high quality data, but do it in a way that also promotes engagement with the communities that you serve. So with that, I went through a lot of material very quickly, but let me pause there and just see if there are any questions. And then otherwise, again, I think we'll be able to really speak to sort of what this can look like in a legal aid organization hearing about Open Doors experience. So any questions off the bat?
Yeah, I have a question about one of the 4Ds. When people, and I forget what it was called, but thank you.
Sure.
The dismissive, like questioning, like, oh, this is performative, you don't really care. Like, how do you, like, recommendations on kind of overcoming that trust gap before you have the opportunity to report out and show action to get that buy-in? That's
a great question. I think around, and I was actually referring more towards colleagues being dismissive, but I think, the concern of clients and others that they don't believe that you're actually, that it can be performative is also a really powerful component. I think a couple things. One is out the gate, the messaging is really important. So I do think that's why it's important to be super thoughtful about setting who sends a message saying that you're getting feedback, the why, be clear about the timeline. Like, these are not things that candidly are typically done. And so I think that can help somebody say, maybe they really mean it. And then honestly, what we find with organizations, their early efforts at feedback, it's not until they've closed the loop multiple times that clients really start to, I think, build more and more of that trust. And so it does take time. I think, though, the other approach I would consider is thinking also about, are there ways, and I don't know how appropriate this is for your context, but thinking about ways to also engage clients in the process. So so often I think, and I've seen this in the field, people are just sent surveys. They don't know who's sending it. They don't know why. They don't really believe the relationship, but thinking about, can you engage clients in helping to design the effort or get their input? Can you have them even help in the delivery? If that is an opportunity, and making this, I think also really, that's another way to be really mindful about the messenger and hopeful there. Those are just some initial ideas, but
Thanks. That just gave me a great idea. I appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this stage? Okay, I'm gonna move us on then. And so gonna now turn and have Virginia talk a little bit about her experience with Open Door. So we're gonna do this kind of interview format, and I have a few slides to back up a few of the points, but wondered, Virginia, if you could first begin by telling us a little bit about Open Door Legal, excuse me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Valerie, for having me. I'm Virginia Taylor. I'm the Legal Services Director and co-founder of Open Door Legal. We opened in 2013. Our mission is that we guarantee free legal representation on all viable civil legal claims or defenses for adult residents of our service area, with the ultimate goal of reducing poverty. Right now, we are in San Francisco, and our service area covers about 2/3 of the low-income population. Things that are unique to our program model that I want to kind of mention related to our surveys is that we have 4 neighborhood offices where guests can walk in to fill out our screening form on iPads. We control our capacity by only increasing our service area when we have resources to provide universal legal services to people in those new districts. We have about 35 different sub areas of law that we help in, and we target the area of law that other groups or private attorneys don't cover.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about what the impetus was for gathering client feedback and yeah, what drew you into that work?
Yeah, we are a member and community-driven organization. Clients actually have a voting ability in our bylaws, and former clients have always been on our board. We actually started in 2013 in a Salvation Army in the most low-income part area of San Francisco. So we wanted to be we have always been really community-based. We actually, thankfully, one of our funders sponsored us to do the Listen for Good survey in 2018. Now that sponsor actually sponsors all of the nonprofits that they donate to work with Listen for Good. The cool thing about Listen for Good was that I got to go to a conference in Texas in 2019 with a colleague, and we remember one of the stories that was given by another organization was they had discovered from their data that one of their offices was never open to clients on time. And I remember that we thought this story was really mind-blowing because we still worked daily out of one office, and we knew like intimately if the office had been opened on time. So we thought we didn't need surveys to tell us things that we already kind of knew that were obvious. But now we have grown so much in the size of organization and having 4 offices and with COVID and so many more people, I don't know everything that's going on. So the survey really keeps me in the loop about everything that's going on with our services. And I'm glad we started it before we scaled because now we have a lot of data to compare it to.
Great. So going through mirroring that cycle that we talked through earlier, can you talk a little bit about the types of questions and the content of what you're asking clients about on a regular basis?
Yeah, so Listen for Good had like 5 questions that they suggested when we started with those questions.
Show those.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so these are the first 5. The first one is used for an average or an NPS score that can be done with it. And then the other ones, the 2 and 3, people write in things that we use. And then 4 is used a lot for marketing and like fundraising stuff because it's like large, extreme, those kind of things. And the same with kind of 5 is pretty similar to 4. Yeah, and then the ones that we got to customize 6 and down. So our organization really values that our clients are treated well. We do trauma-informed services and those kind of things. So we put this question in about respect. I really like this question because sometimes people will give lower ratings on other things if they're not maybe unhappy with the outcomes of their case, but they always say that our staff is treating them with respect. So that number stays really high, and it really means a lot to me that people are really being felt like they're being treated with respect. 7 is about being informed. This one is just because, not hearing from your lawyer is a common complaint that people all over the legal industry have. And so we wanted to be able to kind of track that feeling, which is sometimes different than fact, but we wanted to be able to track the feeling. And then 8, so Adrian and I, my co-founder, we met in a class called Rebellious Lawyering at the University of San Francisco. And that philosophy is about being collaborative with your clients. So we really want for the value that we've always stressed. So we like asking that question. And then 9, were there any barriers from us? So because our mission is like availability and access, is important us to know about if there's any barriers that we didn't know about that we could help people with. And then 10, about anything else that we could not help you with that we wish you could have. We put this in to discover like legal issues that we could help with that were more, because we try to be so holistic. We try to cover so many areas of law. There's another area of law that we could help with. But in reality now, mainly people put social service things in that section, so we can figure out what referrals we need or what contacts we need or what we can help with, like other things that aren't legal.
Super helpful. And how do you all administer this, or sort of what's the cycle? Can you paint for us how you're gathering this feedback regularly?
Yeah, so we have clients, and clients are people who have signed legal agreements with us. And they are sent our client feedback survey with a text in a link to fill out the survey. They are texted that link 1 month after their case is open and 1 week after it is closed. So we do a like mid-case check-in with that 1 month, and then we're checking in at the end with the closed. The data is actually automatically texted and automatically comes back into our Salesforce case management system, as we are not a paper-based organization and don't really didn't want to do as much data entry. And then because that system, we know texting doesn't always work with our clientele. Every summer, all the clients who do not respond to their texts are called by an undergrad intern, and that person completes the survey over the phone with them. And then the intern does do the manual entry into our Salesforce system, but the intern gets a lot out of this project. The text is only in English, but the calls are, which we wish we were able to get changed, but we haven't been with our own, because of our own issues. The calls are in all languages, which is really good. So we make sure to call in all using language line or interpreters for kind of every language. This year, our response rate was 74% for getting at least one survey response from every client who was texted a survey. But we had about 1,000 active cases in 2022. So I think we're actually hearing from only about 20% of our clients, just because of when some cases don't close or open within the period and different things like that. Also our case closing letter that we send does say in it that we'll be sending a text for feedback, and we want to know how to improve.
Great. Can you talk a bit about sort of the issue of anonymity and confidentiality? So as I mentioned earlier, Listen for Good is we generally encourage anonymity, but there's trade-offs to that. And then I know as lawyers, you all probably have a lot of questions about confidentiality of the data. So we'd just love to hear how you all think about that.
Yeah, so the results are confidential. They're all in our confidential kind of case management system, and only done by people who are in our confidentiality sphere. We don't have a fully anonymous survey, as we did want to be able to make changes on the ongoing representation and see if we could help with anything as it was going on. So that required knowing who the person was and connecting the text and the text answers to the case. So, but what we didn't want was that that staff's behavior would change based on trying to get a good score or a bad score, or what was said, or things like that. So the legal staff don't see the results of the surveys. Only the director level program staff and some development staff have access to the results. So, and then the text data goes directly into Salesforce, and then myself and my deputy and our executive directors subscribe to the data report. And so that's emailed to us weekly. We get the report. So then low scores or interesting comments can be flagged and followed up on by us.
That's great. That's great. So how have you used the data? Can you talk a little bit about what you found valuable of having the feedback practice?
Yeah, so the first thing is that we use the data to make our services run better, so, better quality and more equitable for our clients, thus our community. At the end of every summer, my intern analyzes the last year's data and compares it to the previous year's data to look for trends. Intern also makes a PowerPoint and presents it to our staff and the board and eventually the clients. At the staff meeting, we'll try to find 3 trends in the qualitative data and then brainstorm actions on how to fix those things. Then we commit to doing about 3 things each year to grow. An example of one of those things is that one year we saw a trend of comments of clients wanting more Spanish language capacity and Latinx cultural competency from the organization. So then the next year we were able to hire more Spanish speaking staff when we had open positions. And then the year after that, we didn't have those comments anymore. So it was kind of nice.
That's great.
Yeah, and then the results to the client informed question and the first overall question are the 2 that can feel the most personal to staff. If the data on the client informed question has a big jump, then normally that's a sign that something's kind of going on. Staff will say that, I'm only required to tell clients certain types of strategic updates on their cases, but the client's calling me all the time, which is true. And we get that. There's likely no easy answer to this. And everyone knows and that everything has a balance. But strategically, this information can help us as an org decide if we need to focus on funding more social workers or paralegals to make those calls. Also, we notice that the client-informed scope goes down when there's been staff changes, like someone has left and someone new has started, or the interns all leave at the end of the summer. So we made some new best practice guidelines for making sure clients are communicated within those transitions. We can also track the data by legal department and attorneys, so it can help us ID when we should offer to more specific attorneys to participate in our one-on-one client management training cohort. Because maybe the attorney just needs to kind of do some reflecting around why, setting client clear expectation boundaries with the client is hard for them. And then, maybe if they can do some work on that, then the score can go up. We don't use it for we try to make it really clear. It's they're not in trouble, but we try to offer that, service and training. And then the big second thing we use the data for is for internal motivation with our staff. So the positive quotes and data can be really useful for lifting up staff morale and keeping everyone connected while we do the work. Positive quotes from the survey results are shared anonymously with the direct staff or sometimes with the org as a whole. We have a braggadocious Slack channel that we use. And that's the main feedback that we get on the comment section are people saying that we should expand our service area to more places that they can refer their friends. And that can help really a lot with motivating support around change management for scaling and expansion. We also do a fun word cloud every year that we send out. And then the third thing that I think that some people might be interested on in this call is that we use the data to ensure that our board and our funders, that the work is making a difference in people's life and is high quality. So we report the client feedback data to my board, my client committee, and then the full board. We also put the data in our year-end review to our funders. We also put the client data in our public and foundation grant reports. So we can create reports on Salesforce with the feedback data for cases that were funded by a specific grant that we're reporting on. And then we can say for those cases you funded, those clients reported, a 9.5 out of 10 for satisfaction. And then when applying for the grants, we just mentioned that we can pull this data as a response to the question that all the grant people ask, which is how do you collect feedback? We also track case outcomes separately.
That's great. How do you, and then we'll get ready for questions in a second. So please start priming yourself, but how do you close the loop then also with the clients?
So our client feedback is posted on a page on our website and updated annually. We have an annual meeting open to all of our members, which includes the clients and community members, and report on the client feedback there and ask for live feedback and comments. And then we text. We would love to text back the specific people who filled out the survey, the website link, but that doesn't happen kind of every year due to tech capacity issues, but that would be nice. And I guess my last thing is, with all this said, I want to be clear that like, we are just an example. We don't have everything figured out with our data analysis yet. You know, like maybe an experienced data person would kind of like question a little bit of the integrity of our data sometimes. We're still working on how to correlate years correctly. And staff have kind of noticed that, which made it a little bit harder to get change based on the data. But you know, we still find it really helpful. The actual data is correct and everything. We're just kind of working on the analysis systems.
No, you are not alone, I think, in that regard. So, and yeah, I think one thing is not to I think it's better to start in some way, but know the limitations, of what you're trying to do. I'd like to open it up for questions, either for Virginia about their experience, or also just, our experience of what we've seen in the field. And while you're gathering those, because I know the hour seems to move quickly, I did just want to make my colleague I'd be remiss not to plug the Little Listen for Good. So just to highlight, we have a program. We have two programs we run. We have a premium program and an online plus program. The one costs $6,000, one costs $1,000. You get access to all the services that sort of Virginia's referenced and that I referenced earlier. The main difference between these two programs is the intensity of the coaching support that you receive. And we recruit organizations 2 times per year in January and July. So if anyone on the call were interested in learning more, you'll get these materials afterwards, and you can reach out to me and our team, and we can think about how to pair you up with a funder to sponsor your participation and Listen for Good, because that really is the dominant method that we hear that of how people join and access capacity building services like ours, is that we have about 90 plus funders around the country who we have partnerships and have worked with, and they're able to, in most cases, we're pretty successful at trying to broker and find somebody, a regional partner that they can work with, or a regional funder who can sponsor. So with that, would love to open it up. What questions do you all have? I'm gonna hang in the silence. I know people don't love it, but I've gotten, it's okay. I'm gonna hang there for 1 second, and then if not, I have a question or two. Well, Virginia, I have a question for you. One question that came up during the registration was somebody wanted to know about stories. So how do you think about stories, gathering stories, using stories to demonstrate your impact at Open Door?
Yeah, so Open Door Legal is a very storytelling centered organization. Our development staff who tells most of those stories is here, Jess. We do use the positive feedback answers to ID people that the development team can call to interview. We also have a mark to story button that pops up, which the legal aid staff can click on when they're closing a story, and then the development team can filter that list to know who to call. We normally don't interview a client or use the story publicly until the case is closed, and only with client consent. But we also have that Ragged Dishes channel where people can post things, and then our dev team can follow up with that. So basically, yeah, we can use the surveys to help us like figure out who to ask for the stories.
Great. Thanks for your question. William just chatted in a question. Can you talk about strategies to encourage consistent data entry, either by staff or clients themselves? William, do you want to expand or provide a little bit of context for that, or happy to take
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a problem in, databases a lot of times where we talk about garbage in, garbage out. And, if you start entering, the classic example is always like the Excel when you are entering a date, and the Excel thinks of something as a date when it's not. And so you can end up with a date in a bunch of different formats. And, then it's hard to compare that data across because it's not, you're comparing apples and oranges basically. And so I've had that happen with a number of my clients in terms of just like setting up a database and setting up input fields that are going to give you the the information you need and like the sort of the metrics that you're looking for on the back end, and how to design those in a way, like, is it all drop down menus? Is it radio buttons? Like when you have fields that people can enter information into, do you find that is there a way to get them to, you know, enter the same kind of information? Does that make sense? Is that
Yeah, totally. I can answer, and then, you know, from just some observations, and then I don't know if Virginia, you have perspectives too of how you all think about this. I do think drop downs, you know, are powerful, are helpful for people, right? More and more, I think we're all getting used to drop downs that allow us to, as a way of selecting and making sure that data is consistently entered, to your point, in terms of the format. So I think that's one thing. I think then I would consider also the balance of quantitative and qualitative information. And then, so I hear you on the need to have consistent input data, but I think it's then important also to create a space where somebody can answer things that they may want to say to you, and give you that space. And I would encourage, if you can do that, where they can enter in their own language of choice. That is also, I think, a key signal of sort of accessibility too, right? So it requires you to translate on the back end, but I think it's worth it. I don't know, Virginia, if you all have, I know you collect a lot of data and are pretty tech savvy as an organization. How do you all think about sort of just getting in consistent input fields for data that you're gathering?
I mean, it's hard also, as most of us do outcomes, like that required for grants and stuff. Those are the hardest ones that I have. The client feedback stuff is easier in my view, because the clients can have options and fill it out. I mean, obviously what some person is going to think, you know, a extreme difference is versus a large difference is going to be very different. So it's obviously you're only asking for like feelings, basically, not fact.
What about when you're collecting other input data, like it's part of an intake form, to make sure it's consistent?
Oh, I mean, that's always hard. The trainings are necessary and the things to get people to put the same stuff is difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if that's a perfect answer, William, but hopefully some food for thought. So Jessica had a question here. How do you explain to clients limits in regards to confidentiality, explaining that it's not anonymous and that they might be contacted for more information? Is there a certain disclaimer that you include? We generally recommend that. Yeah. So at Listen for Good, we encourage, if you're going to have something that's non-anonymous, you need to be explicit about that, and then ask people if they'd be willing to be contacted potentially for more information. So it's about being explicit. The other thing we sometimes do is encourage people to almost, and I know this sounds a little painful, but I think it's important. You could do an anonymous survey, but then maybe there's some things that you want to highlight that they may be identified. So it's almost like, let me give an example of that. When we're giving, sometimes we hear from people, how do I give incentives when it's anonymous? And so what we say is you can still do an anonymous survey, but you can almost have like a cover sheet on top, which is where somebody puts who they are so that you can then get the incentive. I think there's a similar process here to your point about if you wanted to contact them later. It's almost like you could have an anonymous survey and then say, well, actually, as I say that, that doesn't make sense. I apologize. That, but kind of being clear and explicit, or just kind of creating an explicit opt-in opportunity would be what I would go for there. Sorry, I mixed my messages, but and Virginia, you've got some language here. Perfect. Other questions? I think we have time for one more. Okay, I'm looking back. There was There was a question here about that was submitted in advance about low-tech data collection methods. So I think I'd want to make a couple things clear. I think from an accessibility perspective, we think it's very important to really support multiple languages where possible. And then, as I mentioned earlier, paper can be very powerful. We've also sometimes had, it sounds, similar to what Open Door Legal has. We've had organizations that have used interns or somebody to help walk somebody through a survey, whether it's interviewing them or being there as a support partner as they are taking the survey. The issue there is obviously you want to make sure it's not somebody who has a power-laden relationship with the individual. So you don't want it to be the lawyer, you don't want it to be maybe their case manager, but an intern or a volunteer, somebody like that can be very helpful. Last question came in. How do we think about using incentives given the possible issue of response bias? So we debate this a lot internally. I think incentives can be very powerful. And as one of my colleagues was just saying on a Slack discussion yesterday, it's sort of about, can you identify the sweet spot of an incentive that is small enough that it's motivating, but also that it's not biasing. The research we've done has suggested that incentives are not necessarily biasing, and I could certainly follow up to this. There's an article that we cite often that looks at the relationship between sweepstakes or maybe giving incentives to everybody. So we've tried to look into those different models and see what the research says on that as well.
We have tried with our phone calls during the summer to offer like a $20 gift card some different years, and it hasn't changed the amount of people that call us back from those voicemails left or anything. And so I don't think we've continued it.
Mm-hmm. Again, this is a hard one. I have a lot of organizations ask me, should we give incentives? And sometimes I think you can try it, and it can work in some contexts. I've seen it work very powerfully in some. I've also seen sort of reminders are very powerful. You don't realize sort of that you will see spikes if you do email surveys clearly on reminder dates, and there's some just technical best practices as well. But I think you kind of have to experiment, to your point, Virginia, and see what works for your context. Well, thank you all for your questions. Hope this was useful. And I think I'll turn it over now to Megan, who's going to close us out.
Thank you, Valerie.